Hello. So the subject that I'm going to speak about, I actually uploaded a video on the subject around 2 weeks ago when it was a little bit more topical, but I think it is very apt at the moment anyway. It's still something that is quite prominent in the UK political discourse right now, and I want to just weigh in on this a little bit and share some of my thoughts because I think it comes down to a lot of important issues of discrimination, or perhaps prejudice is a better word, um, bigoted attitudes, and the nature of freedom of expression. All of these things come into play. The issue I want to discuss is anti Semitism in the UK generally, but specifically as it is charged against the Labour Party. Um, Now, the reason I didn't upload it is before is partly because the video was a bit too long, and also the sound quality wasn't great, and I found there was a lot of subjects I wanted to speak about. So hopefully the sound quality will be better in this. As a general note, I do apologize. I am aware that the sound quality in my videos is not wonderful. Honestly speaking, there's nothing I can do about it. I had a virus a while back, and I always make these videos on full volume. I've checked the volume settings. I don't know what else I can do. So please bear with me for a while at least. At some point, I'm going to get another laptop, but I think it's still audible though, because I've listened to some of these videos myself, and I think it's still audible. So there's a few sort of incidents, or let's say case examples that sort of highlighted this problem, both within the Labour Party and a bit beyond that. And it's involved at least three people, three prominent people. Malia Boesha, who's the new NUS president, although I should say, as far as I know, she's not a member of the Labour Party, so that's outside the Labour Party. Um, Naz Khan, excuse me, Naz Shah, who is a Labour Party MP from Bradford, and the former Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone. So Malia Boesha has attracted controversy for a lot of reasons, which I'm not going to go into here because I've already covered the main issues. But one of the things that she was accused of, or that attracted controversy, is that she was talking about Zionist controlled media. Um, Now, this sort of language is problematic because, firstly, there's little basis in that. I think it's a conspiracy theory with little actual basis. Secondly, it does lend into a trope of anti-Jewish sentiment. Now, I'm aware that she has, gone out of her way to show that she's not anti-Jewish. For example, she's met with Jewish students, and she insisted that she was only criticizing Israeli policy and not Jews. This is a common theme among those accused of anti-Semitism, and it's something I do want to talk about a little bit later in the video. I think it's a very important point, and it's something I want to touch on and share my thoughts on. So that was the first controversy. The second issue was to do with Naz Shah, this Labour MP. Now, apparently, a few years ago, and this comes into the issue of the power of cyberspace, she had shared a post talking about the relocation of Israel to the United States to solve the Arab Israeli conflict. That has attracted controversy. It's emerged recently. I must say, I always wonder who sort of digs up these things and then brings them back. I do think there's maybe politics at play with that. However, the important thing is that she has apologized. So she herself obviously thought this was, she was contrite about it and she has apologized. But just as she was apologizing, Ken Livingstone comes in and defends her. Um, and in part of his defense, he actually said that Adolf Hitler supported Zionism. Now, this caused basically a political landslide, earthquake. It really did attract a lot of controversy. And just as a testament to that, this is the cover of the week, sort of satirical magazine. So there you see Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader, kind of tagging Ken Livingstone. Livingstone's always been a maverick, radical figure. He's always basically said what's on his mind. And I have to say, I sort of respect him for that. He's much more to the left than I am. I've actually got his biography, and it'll be interesting to see his insight on some of these things. He's, it's fair to say, a controversial figure because he is so outspoken. And incidentally, although he's on the left, he's very politically incorrect. Now, what I mean by that is we always associate political correctness as something that the left kind of dictates, but I think there is such a thing as right wing political correctness. And Reds Ken has very often found himself being pressured to apologise for something he said. Now, looking at his actual statement, he said Hitler supported Zionism. This supposedly goes into archives or historical perceived documents that say Hitler actually worked with a small group of Zionist Jews in Germany in the 30s. Um, the historian Anthony Beaver has challenged this point, saying that Hitler himself would have cringed at the idea of working with Jews. However, other leading Nazis like Himmler did. Um, I'm always very cautious with this for several reasons. Firstly, I think when we're talking about historical reputation of certain figures, I do believe we need to be careful to leave it to the historians, people who have actually done exhaustive research on these subjects. Um, Ken Livingstone sort of taking himself to be a historian. Well, whether he's right or wrong, I simply don't know. That's why I'm reluctant to either criticize him or endorse his viewpoint. You could definitely see why this would be controversial, basically saying that the most notorious killer of Jews in history and one of the very worst tyrants in history helped a group of people whose ideology was creating a homeland for the Jewish people. So you could definitely see where the controversy lies. Ken Livingstone was under a lot of pressure to apologise, and he has never done so. On one hand, I sort of respect that because say what you want about the opinion itself, but it demonstrates he has conviction. He might be completely wrong in this opinion, but I don't believe that people should apologise when they genuinely believe that they're right. Now, people have said maybe he shouldn't have said anything. That's a fair enough point. He may well have added fuel to the fire in all of this. But if he genuinely believes that that is the truth, rather than just saying it to be provocative, then should he apologise for what he perceives to be the truth? Now, whether it is the truth or not, I don't know. I'm not a historian. I think that's something for historians to debate. But it's certainly an inflammatory thing to say. George Galloway, not surprisingly, has backed him. George Galloway is an even more controversial figure of the hard left. He has worked for Press TV. He co-founded the Respect Party, which is a fringe political party, and many people accuse him of basically being extremely anti-British. He's a very controversial figure. He used to be a member of the Labour Party, but he left during the time of the Iraq War, and he's become one of the most divisive and controversial figures on the hard left in the country. So it's not surprising that George Galloway would back that. Among the Jewish community, it's inevitably been extremely controversial to the point where there were two high profile situations. The MP, John Mann, actually verbally harassed Ken Livingstone directly, not just online. He actually directly confronted Livingstone and basically yelled in his face, calling him a horrible fascist, and continue to rant like that. Personally, I think that was very unprofessional for an MP to behave. Whatever your views are on this subject, and no matter how strongly you feel about something, I think if you're an elected MP, you have to behave in a responsible manner. John Mann could have made that point in a different way. He could have challenged Ken Livingstone to a debate or something like that. But to just verbally harass another elected politician I think that's quite unprofessional. And the second incident was a guy took it on himself to hang the flag of Israel outside Mr. Livingstone's house. Now, therein lies another problematic issue. At what point does criticism of Israel get clouded with genuine anti Semitism? First of all, we need to look at the word Semitism. Today is taken to be anti Jewish sentiment. But the word Semite actually traditionally meant people from the Near East. If you look at old atlases and so on, they talk about Semitic people as including Arabs. So at some point that kind of got translated as anti-Jewish. Um, a quick point about my own stance on the general issue of anti-Jewish sentiment in this country. I do think it is a real issue, and I do think that it is right that the Labour Party is called out for this now. Jeremy Corbyn has said he's acted very fast whenever these things have been exposed, and not just Naz Shah, but when councillors have been accused of anti-Jewish sentiment, especially, has to be said, Muslim councillors. Um, However, one of the criticisms of Corbyn is that he's been too slow to act, and that he, in fact, the new mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was one of those who criticised Corbyn for being ostensibly too slow to act. The thing about the Labour Party and actually about Jeremy Corbyn himself is he will always make a generic condemnation. And this is what he done with terrorism in Northern Ireland. It was kind of like, we absolutely abhor anti Semitism in all its forms. The Labour Party is not anti Semitic. We're against all forms of racism. Now, the problem with this is by making it a broad issue, I think Corbyn is underestimating the fact that the Labour Party really is being perceived as being deeply anti Semitic. So he can make a generic condemnation of racism, but the Labour Party is not seen to be racist against other groups, which means it's trivialising this charge of anti Semitism. So I think Corbyn would be better to focus just on this issue, at least for the moment, because that is where the charge is coming from. Do I think that the Labour Party is anti Semitic? As a party, no, not really. I don't think you can talk about an entire party, the second largest party in the country, as being point blank anti Semitic, especially given that there's Jewish MPs. But is there anti Semitism within the Labour Party? Yes, there is. Um, and I do think that there is a problem, especially among some Muslims, of basically using criticism of Israel as a cover for genuine anti Jewish sentiment. Um, if we look at Pakistan, and this does have relevance, there was a group of people from the Muslim League holding a banner congratulating Sadiq Khan. Okay, nothing very unusual about that. Sadiq Khan's a Pakistani Briton. But underneath the sign, this was in the paper today, it said he beat the millionaire Jew, obviously referring to Zach Goldsmith. Now, I'm sure Mr. Khan himself would cringe at this sort of sign, but the reason that's relevant is because I think that sort of mentality resonates with many people in this country, particularly within the Muslim community. That's not to say for a second that every Muslim is anti Semitic, of course not. But I think it's being disingenuous to pretend that there isn't a problem here. However, I would also add something to this, and I think this is very important. I do think that right wing Jews have sort of hijacked this debate, and they are kind of arrogantly assuming they and they alone are the voice of the Jewish people. This is just as obnoxious as Islamists claiming to be the voice of all Muslims. The fact of the matter is, Jewish people, like anyone else, are very diverse. You have liberal Jews, Orthodox Jews, traditional Jews, conservative Jews, socialist Jews. They're as diverse as anyone else. And I have seen a number of prominent Jewish figures, I believe Gerald Kaufman, the MP, was one of them, who said that it is becoming unfortunate that automatically criticism of Israel is being lumped in with anti Semitism. I think there are some people who use that as a cover, but I do think there is a freedom of expression issue here. And I think right wing Jewish people are not helping. Because basically what they're saying is any opinion perceived to be even against the state of Israel is automatically translated as anti Jewish, or even against Zionism as an ideology. Now, personally, I disagree with those who say that being critical of Zionism equates to hating Jews. I understand the arguments about Zionism as an ideology in terms of those in favour of it, but to link that in completely negates the fact that they're anti Zionist Jews. I mean, it does frustrate me to some extent that I believe right wingers within the Jewish community have basically hijacked this. And people like Mark Regev, the new Israeli ambassador to the UK, he claimed that Israel is open to criticism. But the point is, whenever Israel is criticized, people like him turn around and say it's anti Semitic. So you can't have it both ways. You can't claim that Israel is open to criticism and then automatically say that is anti Semitism. I mean, I'm not entirely pro everything Israel does. I've been critical of some of Israel's actions. Does that mean I hate Jews? Of course not. But I think, the problem is there's extremists on both sides, and they're not helping this situation because there is genuine anti-Jewish sentiments out there. Um, but there has to be some sort of acceptance of what is the red line. And I don't think it's the case that any time anyone says anything about Israel, they're a horrible anti Semite. I do think that some of the things they say are nonsense. And I do think a lot of these points can be challenged. And I have actually defended Israel at times. But I've also said that with the caveat Israel is not above criticism. And I will absolutely argue with anyone who says that it is. No country on earth should be above criticism. So there is another factor to this as well. The argument that the reason there is a unique situation when it comes to discrimination against Jewish people, because there are those who say there's double standards. I think the problem is that no religious group has been as systematically persecuted as long as the Jewish people have. Long, long before Hitler in the Third Reich, there was pogroms in Tsarist Russia, and throughout the history of medieval Europe, there was horrendous anti-Jewish attitudes. Jews were blamed for the Black Death. They were frequently scapegoated. There was massacres all over Europe. So there is a very, very long track record of exceptional, disproportionate discrimination, violent discrimination against Jewish people. Going way back to the coronation of King Richard I here in England, um, there was 30 Jews killed on the day of his coronation in anti-Semitic rioting. There was blood libels throughout England, and England was actually more moderate compared to other parts of Europe. Um, in York, in a place called Clifford's Tower, in fact, the year after Richard was crowned, 150 Jewish people took their own lives rather than be killed by the mob below. That's still a landmark in the city today. So there is actually a track record of this in a way that is different from what Christians and Muslims have went through, at least in Europe. Certainly, Christians have been persecuted in the Middle East. Um, so that is worth bearing in mind. If people sometimes think the Jews are too sensitive, I think it's important to remember that fact. The problem is when people like Malia Boetia say that they're not anti-Semitic, but then they use language like it's the Zionist-controlled media. That's not a criticism of Zionism. That is getting into something deeper, which is basically lending to one of the oldest conspiracy theories in the book that the Jews control the world and they control all the media networks. Actually, this has little basis in fact. If you actually do a bit of research, rather than believing far-right cranks, um, you'll find, for example, I've heard people talk about YouTube, referring to YouTube. YouTube was established by a Chinese American, an Indian American, and a white guy who, as far as I know, isn't Jewish. But even if he was, he's only one third of the equation. So there is a lot of conspiracy theories out there about the Jews that really just lends to very unhelpful tropes in this. But what I would say is that for Jewish people, I can certainly understand the sensitivity, but they also need to say that both the state of Israel and actually the religion itself shouldn't be above criticism. There is a big, big difference between criticizing a religion and hating people who follow the religion. Now, there are certain Jewish practices I have a problem with. There is certain types of Orthodox Judaism, for example, is absolutely just as backward as the Islamists. Recently, there was a case where there was certain a hardline sect of Orthodox Jews who refused to sit beside women on a plane. I mean, that sort of thinking is just as bad as the Islamists. And I have absolutely no problem whatsoever with that being called out. The problem is when people get into conspiracy theories, saying things like the Jews control the media, it's no better than saying all Muslims are terrorists. It's a dangerous, misguided trope that ultimately does lead to hatred. Um, so these are all important factors. So that's just a few of my thoughts. Basically, what I hope I've presented here is not a neutral stance because that would sound kind of flimsy. I think where there is clear hatred of Jewish people, That should absolutely be robustly condemned without any exceptions, without any what abouteries or what ifs. It's wrong, full stop. But that is something in itself. Criticism of Zionism as an ideology, criticism of the state of Israel, or criticism of some aspects of religious doctrine, I think is completely legitimate. And if you say it's not, then you can't call yourself a Democrat. You cannot say that you're part of a society that believes in freedom of expression if you want to silence people from having opinions on ideologies, countries, and aspects of religious practice. Um, those are very, very different things from hating people for who they are. Now, what Mark Regev said is that criticism of Israel is valid as long as it's legitimate criticism. I suppose what he was getting at is that when people talk about relocating Israel, that's that's different from just criticizing Israel, and I suppose that's a fair point. But um, I have seen situations where people have just been criticizing Israel, and they have automatically been pounced on by right-wing Jewish people or Zionists who have branded them as being horrible, hateful, anti-Jewish people. And I have seen liberal Jews denounced as traitors simply for speaking out against Israeli policy. Um, like I say, there is diversity among the Jewish people, just as there is among Christians and Muslims. Just because there's fewer Jews doesn't mean that there is no diversity among them, because there is. So I've covered a lot of issues there. Let me know your thoughts. I think freedom of expression is paramount. I really do. But freedom of expression doesn't mean advocating hatred. And people who are genuinely advocating hatred against Jewish people should be kicked out of political parties, and they should face serious consequences for that, because if you're advocating violence against a minority group, it's dangerous. That goes without saying. As for relocating Israel, thoroughly stupid. But Naz Shah did apologize for that. Final point, some people have accused the Tories of hypocrisy. And in fact, Ken Livingstone has kind of trivialized things, and I think he's wrong about this by saying, oh, it's all just a plot by Blairites to bring down Jeremy Corbyn. Um, you could argue that this is all a big media campaign to kind of slander Corbyn, but the truth is, for many years, the Labour Party has been pointing fingers at the right and saying, "Oh, you're the racists." That's where there is anti-Jewish sentiments within their party. It's no good making generic condemnations of racism. If it's a specific issue, you need to address the specific issue, not just make a generic condemnation of racism. So I'm not quite sure if Corbyn's handled this the best way. Um, Especially since he has personally and he has been linked to people who have defended Hamas and Hezbollah, does not help.